Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us again today on our monthly webinar here. We're going to talk about building a programmatic OT cybersecurity program with Tammy Klotz, and we'll do a quick introduction in a second. We will be sending out a video and the document later, so no need for taking all the copious notes. You can get that. We encourage Q&A. We're going to definitely in this webinar make sure we schedule some time at the end for Q&A. We have some questions that were sent in before the webinar, but obviously if folks have questions as we go here, please do enter them in the Q&A there on the screen. So with no further ado, those of you who have been here before know who I am. I'm John Livingston. I'm the CEO of Verve. Been with the company about 20 years, and you probably know who Verve is if you've joined us before. We've been in the OT cyberspace for about 30 years. We formed the company originally as an industrial controls engineering firm, and then developed a software product about 15 years ago called the Verve Security Center, where we are essentially providing a comprehensive OT security solution to our customers. And then we also offer a range of services around OT security, everything from tech-enabled assessments using our software to network segmentation, remediation support, managed services, et cetera. But today is really about my co-presenter here, Tammy Klotz. So Tammy, I'll let you introduce yourself and we'll dive in.
Excellent. John, I want to thank you and the Verve team for inviting me to participate with you all today. So for the audience, my name is Tammy Klotz. I am currently the CISO at Covanta Energy. We are a sustainable materials management company headquartered in Morristown, New Jersey. I have spent 25 years in the IT industry across spanning 3 different companies. The last 7 of those have been predominantly focused in the cyberspace, both at Covanta as well as my prior company, Verve, which you'll also hear about a little bit later. I had overall responsibility for the cybersecurity program, which in both organizations did include the OT, the operational technology cybersecurity space. So looking forward to the conversation today, and hope there's something in it for everyone who is on the call today. So thanks again for inviting me and being able to participate today.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for joining us. It's going to be a great conversation. I'm sure people will learn a lot from your experience. So the way we're going to break this down today is I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of some of the context for this, and I'm sure Tammy will pile on in her section in terms of the real challenges of OT cybersecurity. Then Tammy's going to take us through what she has found to be successful in her experiences, both at Verve as well as more recently at Covanta. And then we'll sum up a little bit with, how does that approach work? Sort of going from the specific, as Tammy talks about it, to the more general. And then we're going to reserve some time for questions towards the end. So just a quick, sort of review of some of the challenges in OT cyber, whether we call it OT, industrial control systems, IIoT. Really, we're under what we refer to as an air raid. We've got a significant increase in the number of attackers, commercial hackers primarily, coming after the OT environments. Ransomware has become a whole new way of living for people, and industrials are right in the crosshairs of that. We've got a lot of IT integration going on that's creating more risks in OT. Regulation obviously is increasing, and I think only going to get more and more so across industries. Tammy has some experience with NERC, SIP, and other ones of those. Resource constraints, probably the single biggest challenge that people have. Increasing vendor and remote access. This was partly originally driven by COVID, but we're seeing it expand dramatically. Insurance, I don't know if any of you have tried to get OT cyber insurance of late, but those prices have literally tripled. And require all new forms, and those forms require really the ability to show kind of the same level of security in OT that we're achieving in IT. And then obviously boards are getting involved in this, directors, to start to put a bigger focus on this. So it's a big issue, and it's a big issue because of the complexity of these different angles. The good news is, in some ways, CISA has had some very consistent recommendations, and I won't go through all of these. For those of you who haven't seen this, it's available on the CISA website. It's in some ways, it's not hard to know the kinds of things one needs to do to protect their ICS or OT environments. The hard part is actually doing it, right? Network architecture, I'm going to hear from Tammy. How do you actually do that in OT? How do you do host security on a bunch of systems that you can't naturally put the traditional IT kind of host security tools on? And so when we think about this, it's a lot about the how rather than just the what. And I'm sure we're going to hear about that today. And then there's the hot topic of how do you get IT and OT to work together? The graphic here is, IT is from Mars, OT is from Venus, the old the old book. And it's really true, right? We just have very different perspectives. And I think hearing from Tammy today, talk about, who's had the IT hat for a long time, who's been from Mars and now is from Venus, and how do you put these two worlds together? Because it's obviously totally different, right? The way that the groups think about what's critical, right? From, I've had all sorts of bad experience. I'm the OT person. I've had all sorts of bad experiences when IT tried to patch my systems or something, my favorite was we were working with a client and we finally got IT and OT in the same room, and IT was describing scanning, vulnerability scanning. And the OT guys said, you do realize that every time you do that, you basically brick 2 or 3 of our PLCs and we have to go back and redo everything. And no one had any idea. Anyway, so how do we deal with this? And then back to the resourcing point, right? And this comes out of the 2019 survey, the 2020 survey, the 2021 survey. They all say the same thing, which is insufficient resources. We just don't have enough people who know ICS security. And a lot of people will talk about budgets. I can't get the people to buy into the ROI. But if you look at the real problem, 60% of the time, roughly, it's expertise. And so all of these challenges, Tammy has had to deal with. And so we're excited to have her come and talk about how she dealt with the air raid, how she dealt with some of the resourcing challenges, the IT-OT conflicts, et cetera. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Tammy to talk us through her experiences.
Excellent. All right. So thanks for the intro, John. And hopefully, as I walk through this, certainly if you all have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we will address them towards the end. But, a lot of the things that John has mentioned will come up in my part of this presentation. I'm going to focus on talking to you about the keys to success that I've used in both companies and have proven to be successful for myself as the CISO for both of these companies, as well as for both the IT and the OT team. Again, just to recap, so Verve materials, chemical manufacturing, hazardous materials, definitely, concerning from a life safety perspective, that if there was some sort of attack and things were inappropriately managed, handled, controlled, there could have been the extent of loss of life from toxic poisoning, anything like that in the communities in which we operate. So loss of life was a real risk for us that needed to be managed. And then similarly here at Covanta, very different business model, but manufacturing of sorts in our waste to energy facilities. We basically have two different types of businesses that we run right now. One very much focused on sustainable materials management, recycling, and proper disposal of things like medical waste and such. But at our waste to energy facilities, what we're actually doing is we are the recipient of residential trash that is being brought in from haulers from all of your neighborhoods and getting dumped onto our tipping floor. And then it goes through a separation process and makes its way through the tipping floor, through the conveyors, to the incinerator, to the boiler that is actually burning the trash, producing the steam and converting it to energy. So lots of hazards along the way in the event of some sort of explosion. Obviously, definitely concerns from a toxicity perspective, depending upon what is in the garbage. It's obviously not going through our normal emissions management systems that we have in play. And then also, risk of fire obviously is a big one. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes here, because that's very real for us, especially right now. So I can touch on that a little bit as well. So definitely industrial risk in both organizations, very different. But what I'm here to talk to you about is how we approached the cybersecurity program to address the risks at both of the companies. So I have 6 keys to success that I'm going to talk through with all of you today. And I have one slide for each of these just to kind of set expectations appropriately. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll talk about the first one, which is really focused on the relationships. And I cannot emphasize this enough for all of you. While technology is at the heart of what we do and how we do it, without a foundational relationship that coexists between your IT and your operations group, your engineering groups, you will not be successful. So in both companies, it was really about getting executive level buy-in, not only from IT, but actually more importantly from the chief operating officer, who oversees all of the operations that actually occur at our facilities. So that one is a big one, because when you're trying to deliver and get buy-in to do stuff at your plants, at your manufacturing facilities, it's going to come across and be more well received from the boss of the individuals who work at that facility than the IT guy or girl who is dictating what actually needs to be done. So the other thing to kind of complement that is really around making sure that there are a defined set of shared goals and objectives that the project team is really working on as you go and start to build your program. So what we've done here is really a 3-in-the-box program structure. A lot of times you'll hear reference to 2-in-the-box, but with the type of work that's going on here, you really need somebody who is representing the IT organization, their partner, if you will, on the old OT side, which traditionally is somebody in like a corporate operations or corporate engineering function. And then obviously the work that we're doing is actually being done at a facility. So you don't want 2 people from corporate marching in and say, hey, I'm here to help. You want to make sure that you have representation from the site, that you've vetted the schedule, that they understand what's going on. And in most cases, they're going to have to help you do what needs to be done when you're actually at the facility implementing some of these new controls. If you have all 3 of those players aligned and working together, this shared responsibility for success definitely resonates much better for the program, because there is not competing tensions around what we're doing or why we're doing it. So you do need to spend the time up front making sure that that is clear and understood. And I can tell you a bit of a story. When I started here at Covanta, I started in June of 2020, so during COVID. And at that point in time, I worked for the CIO, and he told me that my #1 priority was to get this OT cyber stuff sorted out. And I said, okay, however, you need to give me a little bit of time, right? So these people don't know me. I'm new to the organization. There's a built up history, as John alluded to earlier, when IT has tried to do things and it has broken things like PLCs. So the whole, don't touch my stuff mentality is real. And you have to make sure that you spend that time to foster the relationship, to build the trust, to gain the understanding of what is important to the business or to the facility that you're going to be affecting change at. So I like to use the phrase "get into their movie." You cannot be successful if you do not go to your operating facilities to see how it happens. You want to understand what products are being produced, what the processes are, what systems are being used, so that you can formulate a solid foundation of understanding of what is actually being done at the businesses that you are securing as part of your cyber efforts. The other thing that becomes extremely important is understanding, in the event of an outage that is potentially caused by some sort of cyber incident, what is the business impact of that? How much revenue are you going to lose? How much energy are we not going to be able to produce? What's our downstream supply chain that is going to be impacted by this? Are there fines and penalties as a result of not being able to report proper emissions handling? So you can't talk about this like an IT thing, right? Like if the network's down or the server's down, or you've got to talk about it in business terms. And you want to make sure that you establish an on-site presence, spend time at the facilities, and be part of this, right? So, the last thing you want to have happen is that the only time the process control engineer at the site knows who you are is when there's an event. That is not what you want to have happen. You want to make sure that you are developing those relationships all along the way, so that when and if, or they always say when, not if, it happens, that everybody is prepared and there is pre-existing relationships that can be capitalized on to mitigate and fight any sort of event that has affected the business operations. Next slide. All right, so building relationships, obviously foundational. Then you have to spend some time figuring out what you're actually trying to protect. In many cases, you're going to walk into the facility. These systems that run the facilities typically are, depending upon your business, Covanta's 30 years old, right? So the systems that are there are legacy systems. They have a very long life. And when they were purchased, there was never any desire or interest for them to be connected to a network, right? So they've grown up in an evolving industry where there's a more of a desire to have connectivity to those systems, whether that's for data analytics, whether that's for remote management or vendor remote support, et cetera. So making sure you know what you need to protect as you go about introducing your OT cyber is going to be very important. What I have found in both cases, that asset management may exist in some format, whether that's on spreadsheets, whether that's in somebody's head, but typically, at least in both of my experiences, there's not been, I guess, a single source of truth to go to that says, here's everything that we've got and what we need to protect. So you want to be able to identify what you are in need to protect from a security perspective. Then, as you're defining how you're going to protect these, you want to make sure as you head into a conversion, a segmentation exercise, that there is a detailed task list that folks are using and folks are following. It does require the plan of how this is going to happen. But the other thing that I'm going to offer to you is there is also a high degree of agility and flexibility that is also required. You can plan and plan and plan, but inevitably, especially in OT, there is definitely some surprises that will come along. There's some device talking to another device that nobody really understands, and does that really need to happen, or is that just an outcome of an unmanaged environment in the past? So making sure you have a plan, but also being able to adjust on the fly as necessary with all of the people that are involved. Providing daily status updates, making sure everybody knows what's going on. If there's changes, making sure that you continue to keep the dialogue open and fluid with your key stakeholders. As you go through, you're definitely going to find issues, like I already mentioned, and it will be very easy to say, oh, we'll deal with that later. And then forget about it, right? So as you're discovering issues and going through your implementation, you want to make sure that you have an active issue tracking log with assigned owners and dates for follow-ups, those types of things. So a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about right now is, kind of core project management type activities. But again, I'm going to stress the criticality of some of this just because of the environment that we're operating in. And then when you're all done doing that post-migration health assessment, is it working as planned? Doing maybe some penetration testing to make sure that we've, accomplished what our goals were, and to demonstrate success. So that's kind of getting ready and knowing what you're headed into and how you're going to measure this, what statuses you need to provide. On the other side of that, you want to have a defined list of, at the end of this, what do I expect to be in place? What's going to be in my toolkit? And how am I actually designing the architecture? What does the network segmentation actually look like? What are the standard set of rules that allow communication within the DMZ in between the IT and the OT networks? Do only the right people have access to what they actually need? And the next one is I think extremely important, is that as you develop your segmentation and any individual zone and conduit type communications, making sure that only the devices that need to talk to one another are actually talking to one another. Oftentimes, if you're doing some, network tracing or traffic tracing, you'll see that there is traffic that is going to places where it definitely causes you to pause and you're trying to understand that. And in most cases, there may be a valid business reason for it, but in other cases, it may have just kind of happened by accident because of how things have evolved in this space. And then really looking towards how you're going to manage any access to the internet to or from your OT assets. Ideally, that doesn't happen at all in your OT environment, because that's obviously an open door for threat actors to get into or bad actors to use. So there needs to be a very controlled way in which you are permitting any type of remote access or access to the internet. So again, it's important to document where you're headed, what your end state is going to look like, and making sure you continue to refresh that. When we did the program here at Covanta, we actually had a set of design principles. Number one at the top of the list was that the goal was not to interrupt plant operations. Yep. And you all have to agree that that is the goal, right? So you do everything in your power to make sure that that is prevented. So using that as kind of a refresh or a reminder kind of at the start of every meeting, when you go to the facility, is extremely important. Go ahead, Erica. So the other thing that will be extremely beneficial to you is doing a risk assessment. So there's definitely, different risks depending upon a couple of different elements, right? And I have 5 of them listed there. And depending upon your business, it could be these same 5, or there may be some additional ones, right? But typically in a safety organization or in an engineering organization, they will do process hazard reviews. They will do HAZOP activities that very much mimic a lot of the same elements that we need to consider from a cyber perspective as well. So they're used to doing the engineering side of this. So the more that you can piggyback with your safety organization to embed some security questions and controls in that, it will become more of a natural progression because they know the process hazard review language. They know how to assign risks based upon, what the business operations are. So you just, and I just is not the right word because that implies that it's easy. But you want to really engage and say, okay, well, I could have the same sort of outcome. And I'll use the fire example. At Covanta, we have, boilers that are burning trash, very high temperature, right? So there's a hazard associated with that, right? That, if I have an uncontrolled burn in some situations, I do run the risk of some emissions issues that I might run into. So depending upon where my facility is, now I need to think about what does that mean to the location or the community that I'm operating under? What are the rules that I've committed to with the county that says, I have to make sure that the emissions is under a certain amount. There's exceedance thresholds so that we do not run into a fine or penalty situation. Are we going to be losing money? In what situations will the revenue be impacted? Is it in dollars per day? Is it in kilowatts per hour? How is that measured? And then you need to be able to extrapolate in the event of a cyber attack. This is potentially how much revenue would be lost. The 2 other things that come into play from a risk perspective is what are the PC operating systems that are being used on, like, your engineering workstations, your operator interface stations. Are these systems up to date? Are they still running Windows 7, Windows NT, Windows 95, and probably you're going to do yes in a lot of those situations. So you need to figure out how you're going to mitigate those risks and do that evaluation along with combining kind of the risk profile. And then very similar for your control system hardware, is your Siemens or your Allen Bradley system or pick a vendor, right? An older system, has it been getting its patches over time? Most likely not. So the vulnerabilities will continue to increase. So if you need to prioritize what you're going to go after first, you want to make sure that you're assessing the risk for each of your facilities. So for our program at Covanta, we had 19 facilities that we needed to begin to implement our network segmentation at. Where do we start? Right? How do I know which sites to do first? Because this isn't a go in 2 days and be done. There's a lot of planning that needs to happen. There's a lot of coordination with the facility that actually needs to happen. So what we did in particular is as John mentioned earlier, we have a few sites in our profile or footprint that are regulated by NERC CIP. Well, guess what? Those immediately went to the top of the list. And that is where we actually did our pilots to ensure that we were able to get the appropriate controls in place sooner, because the risk to Covanta was much higher at those facilities as well. So that then allows you to, prioritize the work, where you're going to go after, getting the value first, and then using that to kind of drive the rest of your deployment plan as well. So you have your relationships, you have your inventory, you have done your risk assessment, and this slide will specifically talk to, I've done all that work. What is the outcome of that, right? So my example that I share with this space is that, you know, if you are needing to understand, again, you want your business partners to say, you know, if I was going to do absolutely everything I would like to, it's going to cost, you know, $10 million. In some cases, the organization may or may not have the appetite for that. So acknowledging what you're going to be able to accomplish kind of, you know, out the gate, and perhaps you need to take a phased approach to this, right? Because ultimately, you know, people can wrap their heads around usually smaller increments from both a scope and a budget perspective. But then if you're upfront about, well, okay, this is what we're not doing, and this is what the risk of not doing that is, you have a very different conversation with whether it's your board of directors who are funding and sanctioning the work that you're doing, whether it's that COO that you're needing to convince that this is what we're going to do, or whether it's the people at the plant, quite honestly, because they're the ones who are going to have to be doing a lot of this work, working with the project team to actually get things done. And I think the interesting thing about this is that, you know, once you get to a place where you've established some governance, you've done some implementations, there is a different set of questions that you can actually ask, right? And my favorite example to share with this one is, okay, so let's say we've got our asset inventory completed. We know what we have at what facilities, and there's all of a sudden a vulnerability that gets announced by, you know, Rockwell or whomever, right? I'm not picking on any particular vendor. In the past, the discovery of, oh, are we affected by this? Usually was met with, I don't know, right? So with a comprehensive asset management system that allows you to track what those assets are, you can actually make a much quicker assessment as to what is the risk of this particular vulnerability. We have that system at 3 of our facilities. This is the process that it's actually controlling. How do we want to mitigate this? Do we need to do it immediately and do an emergency outage? Can it wait for the next outage schedule? Do you understand that by not doing this, this is what the potential is of what could happen? And hopefully, as you've gone through your segmentation efforts as well, you've minimized the attack surface, that if something does happen, it is isolated in one particular area. When we started on this journey in Covanta 2 years ago in February of 2021, you know, we had what I call commingled chaos. We had no network segmentation. Everything was flat. And when I had to do the quote, the sales pitch to get approval and buy-in to do this program, we definitely had to have some, you know, conversations about, well, what are these firewalls, Tammy, that you want to put in, and why do we need 2 of them? And I don't understand, right? So if you can take it out of the context of kind of the technology, the hardware components about it, and talk about it in business terms. So the example that I used, which became very effective, in 2017, Covanta had a pretty significant fire at one of our facilities in Fairfax, Virginia. It took the facility offline for 10 months. We could not burn trash. Since then, we've had another fire, very significant, that started on Super Bowl weekend, Super Bowl Sunday, actually, here in the States. And there was a fire that affected our Miami-Dade facility in Doral, Florida. And having fire be a real risk to your business, honestly, helped explain to executive leadership of why this was important. And I'll share it with all of you is, you know, when I talk to them about the fact that, you know, if there's a fire a physical fire that was not caused by some sort of cyber event, but equipment malfunction, or somebody put something flammable in their trash that has caused something to ignite and the water cannons did not put it out. We can go through all of that. But the likelihood of that fire spreading across the entire fleet of Covanta facilities in the United States is extremely low, right? It is not going to move from Florida to Massachusetts, right? Unless it's some catastrophic, national event, if you will. However, in the event of a ransomware attack, without the proper segmentation, what very well could have happened is that if one of our facilities became infected or affected by a ransomware attack, there was no control to prevent it from going anywhere else in our fleet of facilities, right? So talk about being able to demonstrate the breadth of the impact when you can relate it to something that they're already used to dealing with was extremely helpful. And then you have a different conversation about, okay, so if we don't do this, are you okay with that? Do you want 40 facilities to potentially all be down at the same time? That would be, almost, business ending, right? Where are people going to go with all their trash, right? It's crazy to think about, but that's really what we're dealing with in Florida right now, because folks are, we were the residential trash management company where all of the haulers brought their trash to. What are we going to do with that now? And there's obviously supply chain downstream impacts. And this is where insurance becomes very important. And John touched on that, and I'll make a few comments about that in just a bit as well. The other thing that's important, right, and we run into this all the time. So you go through the program, you do the networks and segmentation, you have a new toolkit that gives you the capabilities for things like USB scanning, antivirus and anti-malware, application whitelisting, backups, all of that stuff to ensure that your OT environment is secure. The last thing you want to have happen is you do all of that and it stops, right? Because there's going to be another piece of equipment that needs to get added to the network. Maybe there's an entirely new facility that you're going to be building. Probably not likely in our industry, but there's plenty of others who would be standing up new manufacturing facilities. So you don't want to start without following what you've just implemented, those same design principles. I don't want to go to a new site and not put the proper network segmentation in. It needs to be part of the design. So as new capital projects are entertained, funded, planned, you want to make sure that those cyber elements are influenced and part of the planning exercise. So establishing some linkages with your PMO from an engineering perspective is extremely important. And then making sure that, the OT security team has a seat or a voice in that conversation as well. The other thing that works fabulously in this space is in manufacturing specifically, or even in like healthcare, right? There is a huge emphasis, or there should be a very significant emphasis on safety, making sure that you're leaving work in the same state in which you arrived in the morning, right? Making sure that safety is the number one priority. Nobody wants loss of life, loss of limb as a result of, either poor process, not following right procedures, equipment failure, etc. So if you can piggyback your security program with your safety program and really change the culture to embed security in the same streams of consciousness and safety meetings, safety, near misses, and in getting, maybe there's a security near miss that you want to adopt, make more public and help people realize. At my last company, honestly, what we did is we did a penetration test at one of our facilities, and it was met with some initial resistance to the few people that we talked to about it. Why are you going to do this? You're going to make people feel bad. We can't really do that. And I was like, time out. This isn't to blame anybody. This is really to demonstrate the art of what could be possible in these situations, and how do we build on that to further protect the organization. And as a result of that, there were definitely some findings from that penetration test that required some follow-up education and awareness. So many of you who are in manufacturing will be, very familiar with safety stand downs. In the event that there's been some catastrophic safety incident that has caused, whether it's loss of life, loss of equipment, whatever it happens to be, right? And certainly not minimizing the loss of life. But, there are safety stand downs that are done in those situations. So at Versum, after we had done this penetration test and there were some findings that needed to be shared, we actually invoked a security stand down with the assistance of our chief operating officer across all of our facilities to say, hey, these are the things that we need to be paying attention to. So if you can bring those two programs together, that can be extremely helpful and beneficial to your overall efforts from a cyber perspective in these OT worlds. The other thing that folks need to wrap their heads around, and this is true about safety, and that's why it's on this slide, right? So in some cases, the intent, depending upon, what is going on, is accidental, right? Nobody hopefully plans to cause, a safety incident, right? In the world of cyber, yes, there are accidental things that happen as well, right? But in a lot of cases, there's intentional intent, and you can think about it from a safety perspective. Is there something like a sabotage going on where you're a direct target from a nation state attack or something like that? But in these situations, there is really, I want to do harm, and this is why I want to do harm, and this is how I'm going to do harm. So differentiating and getting folks' heads wrapped around, if the bad actor is wanting to do something bad, there's usually a reason they're wanting to do that. And again, that can happen with safety, probably a little bit less, I might say, but it is a different thing that folks need to wrap their head around with regards to, this wasn't an accident. Somebody did this because they had a purpose and a plan. Making sure your safety and security controls work together. So if you find yourself, as a result of perhaps a valve being improperly adjusted, does your safety control allow that system to fail in a fail-safe type situation, so that despite what happened, there is no incident that has occurred because the controls worked as designed. And then making sure that, if you have a corporate safety program where there's monthly safety meetings, training, embed the security stuff as part of that. Include security incident reporting as part of your safety incident reporting as well. We're still kind of working through some of this at Covanta, but that became very successful, very important to the kind of the ongoing sustainability of the program at Versum as well. Next slide. Yeah. So then most importantly, all of this stuff leading up to is obviously foundational, critical, and needs to be done. This slide is about, okay, so my project is done. Now what? So this stuff doesn't end, right? There's new threats, there's new vulnerabilities, there's new technology. So you need to make sure that you don't let your guard down, quote, just because the network segmented now. And you need to make sure that as you're, planning for your program, that your executive team, your executive sponsors, your governance team are on board that we're going to have to continue to invest. This wasn't a, $6 million project and we're done, right? Hopefully we don't have to invest to that extreme again, because we've now laid the foundation, but setting an expectation that, we're done and we don't have anything else to do is not an expectation that you actually want to set. So making sure that you are continuing to have ongoing discussions, team meetings between your IT and your OT organizations. What are the issues that we're seeing? What are the new demands that are coming in? Oh, you want to install a new crane at a facility? Well, okay, that means we need to do X, Y, and Z. So you really want to try to minimize the surprises going forward. Perhaps there's going to be a new upgrade that is done. You're going to be moving from an on-prem type solution that the emissions company wants to do something in the cloud. Okay, but I said I can't have internet access to the direct OT system. So how am I going to manage that, right? So keeping it real by continuing to have those conversations, because if not, just going to end up right back where you started. And then, not that this is all for naught, but you haven't, developed that sustainability. So that goes directly into the next point, which is making sure from a management of change perspective, that, if there's a change being initiated by the plant, or by IT or by the corporate engineering function, that is properly documented, and that the necessary approvals are required. Where we're trying to get to here at Covanta is, if you are going to plug anything into the network, it needs to go through a managed change process. Again, we're still maturing in that space, but that is ultimately where we need to get to, because people will plug things in and then not be happy that it doesn't work, because we have controls in place now that don't allow that to communicate. So that will build frustration if not properly planned. Making sure you're assessing your risks, refreshing your risk assessment annually. What's changing in the business? Have you added, a new product lines? We're doing a lot of acquisitions right now at Covanta, so we're bringing in some new business models. Well, what do we need to do there? How are we going to bring them on board, essentially? Making sure you're having your ongoing communications. We've done some tabletop exercise with our NERC SIPs facilities in the event of a cyber attack. How are you going to respond? What are you going to do? How is this going to happen? What you don't, and I mentioned this earlier, what you don't want is that you don't want this to be driven by an event. I don't want to be, the only time I talk to somebody better not be when there's something bad going on. I want them to know who I am, how to reach out to my team. If something is suspicious, how do we have a conversation around that? So we're really trying to establish some presence at these facilities, and we're honestly making some changes right now to our regional model that will potentially enhance the visibility of the IT team, if you will, at our facilities. And then making sure you're doing, your general housekeeping, making sure you're doing your routine access control reviews, do the right people have the right access to the right systems, and making sure you're, reviewing that so that as either people are changing roles, maybe leaving the company, that they no longer have access to the systems that could potentially open your company up to some sort of exposure as well. So it doesn't end, is the bottom line. Keep it real, make sure you're continuing your dialogues and your conversations, and staying in touch with what's actually going on in the environment. I think that's probably my last slide, if I remember.
It is. It is. And thank you, Tammy. I mean, what was great about that is, so there were a number of questions that came in beforehand that we were going to talk about, but you hit on so many of those topics as you went through. And in fact, when we think about the process of how to go about OT security, and we've talked about this in multiple other of our webinars, right? Of the assess, okay, figure out what you need to do. What are your assets? Where are my biggest risks? What's my roadmap? Then I go through this remediation phase of segmentation and whitelisting and patching, whatever. And then you're maintaining, right? As you said, keep it real, right? How do I make sure that I can maintain this on an ongoing basis? It's like lines up right against this same framework. Yeah, so
and we didn't do our slides together, John. So
no, I know it's great that it just lines up together. There are a couple of questions, and I think probably I think we got about 10 minutes. Maybe let's go to some of the questions that came in beforehand. So Let me start with the buy-in part of this. You spent a bunch of time talking about, thinking about safety, thinking about what's the business impact, et cetera. How long does that process take? And then, how do you get the sticky wickets, so to speak, to join in? But start with, how long does that process take, and what's it like?
So it doesn't happen overnight. That's the first thing that I can tell you. So when I got here, and given it was my first ask, I asked for 6 months, right? And again, is that the magic number? No, it's going to depend upon the maturity of your organization. It's going to depend upon, the technical awareness of how cyber can impact a facility or an operation. So it is not a task that is bound by, a period of days. I would say, the more time you spend developing your own credibility with them, and you have to get your OT counterparts to the point of them knowing that you have their best interests at heart. So it's hard when you're the CISO and you sit in IT, right? Because you're still one of the IT people, right? So breaking that mold and saying, I know this is where I sit organizationally, and a lot of CISOs do, not everybody, and in some cases that's changing because of things like this, right? So, it is about that face time, going to these facilities, having conversations, getting dirty, right? And I always say this after I do this presentation, is that I have a picture, not corporate Tammy, but OT Tammy, right? At the facility with the hard hat in front of the crane, masked up, gloves, the whole 9 yards, right? Because you don't want to be perceived as, the corporate person who is at the facility and is, quote, afraid to get dirty, right? So you need to demonstrate that. And so that's a lot of soft stuff for, what is usually a bunch of technical people who just want to go in and get stuff done. So the more you can invest in that relationship building to gain the confidence, I would say, one, it's going to depend on what you're walking into, where you're coming from. And at Covanta, there was a ton of tension between IT and OT, which is not uncommon. But there was no way I was going to walk in, start up a project, and everybody is going to go, yeah, let's do this, right? This was, really, I guess, structured and planned relationship building that needs to be done.
So on that relationship building point, one of the questions, so I know obviously we were involved with you in this journey at Covanta. And, one of the comments you or someone said, right, we need our OT whisperer, right? We need the person to bridge.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that from a, how do you get that trust? And not just what's the partner you need, but how do you build that trust with the folks at the plant?
Yeah, that's really a really good point, John. And that was fundamental to our success, right? So you can bring whatever vendor to the table that you want, right? But in a lot of cases, if it's an IT vendor, they're going to talk about a bunch of IT stuff with a bunch of plant people who are going to go, oh, here we go again, right? So one of the great things that happened in our program was the fact that we brought in some of the Verve resources. They actually came to the facility with us as we were planning for the pilot, right? And those individuals spoke the right language. They knew what a SCADA system was. They knew what a PLC system was. So just the conversation allowed for a much better, I'll call it embracement of, who this team was going to be and how they were going to work together. And I vividly remember the conference room we were in, and we had the team together, and, everybody's drawing on the whiteboard, and there was back and forth communication. And it was like, oh my God, this is like magical, right? Because that dialogue was there and they got it. And that was what was most important. And that built the trust that allowed us to move forward.
That's great. And there was a question in the Q&A that I think follows on to that a bit, which is around training. So, we have to train those folks in the plants. We have to train IT on OT. How did you all think about the training, or how are you thinking about the training that is required for both the IT people about OT security, as well as the folks in the plants about how to deal with cybersecurity?
Yeah. So one of the things, there's obviously a lot of SANS training that is available on ICS technology, things like that, industrial control system work. So certainly, you can encourage folks to attend that. But, if they're not interested, they're not interested, right? So what you want to do, there has to be some element of on-the-job training that maybe not structured training per se, but when you start to talk about risks and what could happen, and actually onboarding some of those key personnel from your OT organization to help carry that torch becomes extremely important, right? So, and even from a tools perspective, opening the door to say, IT isn't necessarily the ones who are going to be managing the output of all of these tools, right? We want the folks at the facility who are dealing with this stuff on a daily basis to be able to recognize when something has gone awry or why the rules are set the way that they are. So again, that is as much of a change for OT as it is for IT. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to readdress the IT team that says, no, you don't get to say we don't do OT stuff anymore. That's not how this is about, what this is about. I cannot go to the board of directors as the CISO and say, oh, that's not my world. That was just affected by a cyber breach or attack. I own the whole thing, right? So getting those two teams together is extremely important. And the other thing that I will tell you helped significantly from a training perspective, and John, you touched on this earlier, is all around the insurance element of this, right? So cybersecurity insurance renewals come up. There's a whole litany of questions now about your OT systems. Nobody previously was involved. IT always answered all those questions. And I'm like, I'm not doing this by myself, right? I had to bring those people in. And then, that was a training exercise in itself because they're like, oh my gosh, like people are really paying attention to this and we need to answer these questions now. So, in some cases, it's not structured training, but it's awareness development, right, of how this is impacting their world. But ongoing, certainly you need to, we'll need to work on a training program because people are going to change, new people are going to come in, and we need to make sure that they're up to speed on the risks associated with this space.